There is a woman I know who, sometime around her 72nd birthday, did something that made almost everyone around her deeply uncomfortable. She stopped answering certain phone calls. She declined invitations she would have once accepted out of obligation. She removed herself from a family group that had been running for years on the shared currency of complaint and gossip. She stopped visiting people who left her feeling smaller than when she arrived. She became, in the language of the people who noticed, difficult, distant, cold, changed, and she became, in the quiet and private language of her own life, the happiest she had ever been. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about what happens when an older person, someone who has spent decades being available and accommodating and present for everyone who needed them, finally makes a different choice. Because that choice, which looks from the outside like withdrawal or bitterness or giving up, is very often something else entirely. It is very often the most honest and courageous act of self-knowledge a person can perform, and the happiness that follows it, quiet and unspectacular as it tends to be, is among the most real happiness I have ever witnessed in a human being. We are not taught to think of it this way. The stories we tell about aging tend to move in one direction. The older person surrounded by family and grandchildren and community, the house full of voices and visits and connection, that is the image that carries the most warmth in our culture. Alone is supposed to mean lost. Cutting off is supposed to mean broken. A person who reduces their circle after 70 is supposed to be sliding toward sadness, not walking toward peace. But the evidence of actual lived experience tells a very different story, and I have been paying close attention to that evidence for a long time. The people I have known who arrived at genuine contentment in their later years, and I mean not performance, not acceptance, not making the best of things, but actual deep contentment, have almost always done some version of what that woman did. They narrowed. They simplified. They let go of connections that were costing more than they were giving. They stopped maintaining relationships out of history or habit or social obligation, and they began, sometimes for the first time in their lives, choosing their company the way they chose everything else that mattered to them. With care, with intention, with full knowledge of their own requirements. What most people do not understand about this kind of narrowing is that it is not about other people at all. It is not about anger at those who are cut off, not about judgment, not about deciding that certain people are unworthy of time and attention. The people who make this choice are almost never doing it from a place of hostility. They are doing it from a place of simple arithmetic. They have looked honestly at their energy, at their time, at what remains of both, and they have done the calculation that most of us avoid because it requires a kind of honesty we find uncomfortable. They have asked, what does this relationship actually give me, and what does it actually cost? And when the answer came back wrong, they trusted it. That trust is hard. Let me be honest about that. After 70 years of being taught that loyalty means permanence, that love means availability, that family means obligation regardless of cost, walking away from a relationship that exhausts and diminishes you feels like a betrayal of something fundamental. It triggers guilt in a way that almost nothing else does. Because the culture around us is very good at making sure that guilt arrives quickly and stays long. The person who cuts off a draining sibling is selfish. The person who stops attending the family gathering that leaves them depleted for 3 days is cold. The person who declines the friendship that has become entirely one-directional is abandoning someone who needs them. But I want to ask a question that the culture does not ask loudly enough. What about the person doing the abandoning? What about what they need? What about the reality that a person who has spent 70 or more years giving their time and energy and presence to others has, by any fair accounting, earned the right to spend what remains differently? There is a reason that seniors who make this choice so often describe feeling lighter. That word comes up again and again in conversations I have had about this, a physical sensation of weight removed, of something that had been pressing down, finally lifting. The weight is not grief for the relationships released. The weight is what those relationships were carrying. Old resentments that were never resolved and never going to be resolved. patterns of interaction that had been running so long they felt like weather, like something that simply happened to you rather than something you were participating in. Roles that had been assigned so many years ago that neither party remembered assigning them. The responsible one, the one who held things together, the one everyone called when there was a problem, the one who could always be relied upon to set aside her own needs for the sake of the group. Those roles are invisible until the moment you step out of them. And the moment you do, two things happen simultaneously. The people who needed you to keep playing that role feel the disruption very intensely, and you feel, perhaps for the first time in decades, who you actually are when nobody is requiring anything of you. That second experience is the one I want to spend time on, because it is the experience that produces the happiness that surprises everyone from the outside. When a senior steps away from the relationships and obligations that have been defining them for years, what they find in that newly cleared space is not emptiness. What they find is themselves, the version of themselves that existed before all the roles accumulated. The version that had preferences and rhythms and interior responses to the world that had been slowly buried under the weight of being needed. And meeting that version at 70 or 75 or 80 is one of the most profound encounters a human being can have. I think about a man I knew who spent his entire adult life as the one his family turned to. Every decision, every crisis, every conflict passed through him. He was competent and steady and genuinely committed to the people he loved, and that combination made him indispensable in a way that looked from the outside like a form of richness. But inside that indispensability, something had been slowly crowded out. At 71, he began the process of stepping back, not dramatically, not with announcements or confrontations, but quietly, consistently, in the way that quiet and consistent people tend to make their most important changes. He stopped being the first call. He stopped attending every gathering. He stopped solving problems that other people were fully capable of solving themselves, and had only stopped solving because he was always there to do it for them. The family was unsettled. Some were hurt, some were confused. His wife worried that something was wrong with him, but he described those years after 71 as the first years of his life in which he had genuine access to his own mind. He took up reading in a serious way, something he had always meant to do but never had the uninterrupted hours for. He began waking early and spending the first 2 hours of each day in a silence that was his alone. He traveled to one place he had always wanted to see and went by himself, which his family considered eccentric, and which he considered the best trip of his life because every moment of it was shaped entirely by his own curiosity. He died at 83, having lived, by his own account and by the account of everyone who knew him well, more fully in his last decade than in any previous one. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern, and the reason it is a pattern has to do with something fundamental about what human beings need in order to thrive. We need, all of us, at every age, some proportion of our time and energy to be genuinely our own, not borrowed by obligation, not consumed by other people's needs and expectations, genuinely, freely, unconditionally our own. In youth and middle age, many people can sustain a life in which that proportion is very small, because the rewards of being needed are intense and the cost of giving yourself away has not yet fully accumulated. But by the time you are 70, the account has been running for a very long time, and the wisdom of your body, your exhaustion, your quiet sense of something important being overdue is telling you the truth about what the balance looks like. The seniors who listen to that truth, who act on it rather than explaining it away, who accept the social discomfort of being seen as cutting off and choose their own well-being anyway, those are the ones who arrive at happiness, not because they stopped caring about other people, but because they finally started caring about themselves with the same seriousness they had spent a lifetime applying to everyone else. There is also something important to understand about what happens to the relationships that survive this kind of narrowing. When a person stops performing connection and starts choosing it, the connections that remain are transformed. The friendship that continues after you have given yourself permission to end the friendships that weren't working is not the same as the friendship that continued simply by default. It has been tested, it has been kept, not because keeping was easier than letting go, but because it was genuinely worth keeping. That gives it a quality that default relationships rarely have. It becomes real in a way that feels different, that has a different texture and weight. Both people know, at some level, that they are there by choice rather than by inertia, and that knowledge changes everything. The grandchildren who visit a grandparent who has learned to protect their time and energy encounter something that the grandchildren of always available grandparents sometimes never find. They encounter a person, not a function, not a role, not the grandmother or grandfather as a category, but a specific individual human being with an interior world and genuine opinions and a way of engaging with the world that is particular and interesting. That quality of presence is only possible in a person who has preserved some part of themselves from the constant consumption of availability. You cannot give what you do not have, and you cannot have something that is always being given away. I want to address something directly because I know it is present in many minds when this subject comes up. Is it not lonely? When you cut away relationships, when you narrow your circle, when you stop accepting every invitation and returning every call, does the space that opens up not become unbearable? I have asked this question of many people who have made these choices, and the answer that comes back is almost never what you might expect. The answer is almost always some version of no, not in the way you think. The loneliness I feel now, if I feel it, is a clean loneliness, a temporary loneliness, a loneliness that comes and goes like weather rather than living in the walls. The loneliness I felt before, inside the relationships that were not working, was a loneliness that never lifted. Because being with people who do not see you, who do not know you, who relate to you only through the role you play for them, is the loneliest experience available to a human being. You can be surrounded by noise and voices and demands, and be more alone inside that than you would ever be in a quiet house with only your own thoughts. The quiet house, it turns out, is not the problem. The quiet house is often the solution. None of this is to say that the process is without difficulty. The social cost of being the one who pulls back is real. People talk, people interpret, people construct narratives about what changed and why, and those narratives are rarely generous. The label of difficult or closed off or bitter gets applied, and it sticks in the way that labels applied by groups tend to stick. Because groups have an interest in maintaining the behavior that serves them, and a person who stops providing that behavior must be explained somehow. But here is what I have noticed about the people who absorb that social cost and continue anyway. They stop needing the narrative to be corrected. The need for other people's understanding, which can be so fierce in younger years, begins to loosen its grip. Partly this is age and the particular freedom that comes from having fewer years left to worry about what people think. But partly it is something earned. A person who has made the hard choice to honor their own inner truth in the face of social disapproval develops a relationship with themselves that is more solid than any they have previously had. They have been tested, they have chosen themselves, and that choice leaves a residue of self-knowledge and self-respect that is very difficult to shake, even when the pressure to return to old roles continues. I want to say something to younger people who might be listening to this alongside someone they love. If the older person in your life has begun to pull back, to decline invitations, to be less available than they once were, before you interpret that as a problem to be solved or a symptom to be worried about, consider another possibility. Consider that what you are witnessing might be the flowering of something that took 70 years to become ready to bloom. Consider that the distance is not rejection. It is arrival. The person is arriving, perhaps for the first time, at the life that was always waiting for them underneath everything that covered it. Your role in that, if you love them, is not to pull them back into availability. It is to go to them, to visit them in the quieter, more intentional, more honest space they are creating, to encounter them there as the person they actually are rather than the role they played for so long. You may find, if you do this, that you get more of them in 2 hours of genuine visit than you ever had in decades of constant presence. Because what you are getting now is not the performance, it is the person, and that person has been worth knowing all along. They were just too busy being needed to let you know them fully. The happiness that comes to people who make these choices after 70 is a particular kind of happiness. It is not the happiness of excitement or achievement or the satisfying of ambitions. It is quieter than that. It sits in the body differently. It is the happiness of a person who has stopped fighting themselves, who has stopped using energy to maintain a version of their life that never quite fit, who has accepted, finally and without apology, the truth of their own nature, their own needs, their own way of moving through the world. It is the happiness that the philosopher might call peace, except that peace sounds passive, and this is not passive at all. It is the result of a very active, very brave, very ongoing decision to live honestly. I am not promising that this kind of happiness comes easily. I am not suggesting that releasing relationships and obligations that have defined you for decades is a simple or comfortable act. I am telling you that the people who have done it describe what follows as among the most alive they have ever felt. Not happy in the way a child is happy, not joyful in the way a young person is joyful, but settled into their own life in a way that makes every ordinary day feel sufficient. Genuinely sufficient. Not as a compromise, not as a resignation, but as a real and honest fullness. If you are past 70 and you find yourself tired in ways that rest does not fix, drained by interactions that used to feel like connection, resentful of obligations you can no longer remember choosing, there may be something your body and your spirit are trying to tell you. They may be telling you that the arithmetic has changed, that the life you built for an earlier version of yourself requires renovation, that some of what you carry belongs to another chapter, and setting it down would not be a loss, it would be a homecoming. The woman I mentioned at the beginning of all this, the one who stopped answering certain calls and declined certain invitations and made people around her uncomfortable with her choosing, is still alive. She lives alone in a house she has arranged entirely to suit herself. She reads whatever she wants. She wakes when her body wakes and sleeps when her body sleeps. She sees the people who genuinely restore her and graciously declines the people who do not. She is 79 years old, and she told me recently, with a directness that I found beautiful, that she has never in her life felt more like herself. Not younger, not free of difficulty or loss or the particular weight that accumulates in a long life, but more like herself. Settled into her own existence in a way that she had spent 7 decades approaching and only recently arrived at. That arrival, quiet and unwitnessed and unremarkable to anyone watching from the outside, is among the most remarkable things I have seen. It is proof, if proof were needed, that it is never too late to become who you actually are. And that sometimes the most direct path to that becoming is the one that looks to everyone else like walking away. It is not walking away. It is walking toward. It has always been walking toward. And the destination, when you finally reach it, is the life that was waiting for you all along inside the quiet you were afraid to choose.